What is jumping out to me here is that you are now being asked questions by me about a policy that was announced over the weekend, is going to be confirmed and doubled down upon today, but actually you don't know what's going on with this
I think,
policy.
but no, but I think what's interesting, Callum, is you're not really interested in the policy, are you? You're
I
not,
am.
because you're not interested in community. You're not interested in people giving something back to their areas, and actually, the world being a better place. What you want to ask questions about is the people who won't do it. Why would people not want to do that? Why would people not want to go out and help their areas, to help people, and to work in that way? You seem to be saying that the youth of today will refuse point blank to do this. Well, I don't accept that.
Well, let's bring in James Daly, Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party and MP for Bury North. Hi, James.
Hi.
So low funds in your constituency in Bury North and Greater Manchester. Low funds, circa £2,000, met with donors, but so far no donations, says Jerry's reporting this afternoon. No donation sounds alarming.
Well, over the last 12 months, I have paid for around 500,000 leaflets and surveys to go out to the people of Bury North and various other campaigning material. So the one thing that cannot be said about my campaign is that I have not paid big sums of money from donors and from others to support my re-election efforts and to do the best job I can for my constituents in Bury North. So I've spent a huge amount of money, Callum, all to try and do the best I can for the people who elected me in 2019.
I hear you on that, but as things stand, it sounds like you've only got £2,000 in the bank.
Oh, we've got more than that.
Okay, so what does this mean then? When this line from this email, low funds, circa 2k, met with donors, but so far no donations.
Well, I actually don't know because I haven't seen this email. What's the date of this email, Cal?
Well, let's bring Jerry Scott back in, actually, who's seen the email. Jerry, you might be able to help with some of the detail on this. James is asking there what date was on this email. He's not seen it.
Yeah, of course. This email was sent on Friday.
There you go, James. Does that help?
Well, it does, but then in the sense I've got more than £2,000, so clearly something has gone awry in respect to that email.
Okay.
And
How much do you have?
You can imagine, Carl, I'm not going to talk about my personal election finances to you, much as I'd love to do that. What I can say to you is that I will have enough money within my fighting fund to send out all the leaflets and all the other campaigning material that is needed.
Okay, so you're not worried about a lack of donations that is apparently highlighted in this email?
Well, first of all, I never worry about anything. And secondly, there will be no issue with donations to my campaign.
You never worry about anything? Do you worry about losing your seat where your majority is 105?
Well, I tell you what I do. Worry in the political sense of the word, Callum, not about life in general. But let me put it this way, that, and I've said this in many interviews, that if the people of Bury want to elect someone else, that is what democracy is about. If they think that somebody who has brought in millions upon millions of pounds of regeneration monies, we've got 3 special educational needs schools being built in the area, a new high school, saved Gig Lane, one of the oldest football stadiums in the country, and the list goes on. If that's not enough, if politics now is not about delivery, and that's what the people of Bury North want to elect somebody else who doesn't have that record, that's absolutely fine. Why would I be bothered about that?
Okay. What do you make of the start of the campaign so far? Because that's the other part of Jerry's reporting today is, as we say, this kind of lack of enthusiasm. Conservative ministers and MPs not getting behind campaigning, refusing to knock on doors, MPs focusing too much on ministerial business, some people going on holiday, all of these sorts of things. Has it been a bit of a sloppy start, actually?
Well, I speak to my colleagues a lot. I'm the deputy chairman of the party. I see the pictures on social media and on the various WhatsApp groups that I'm a part of within the party. And all I see is MPs getting out there, putting their message to their local constituents, working really hard. And I'm not a witness or aware of this, what you're suggesting. I have a lot of good colleagues who have brought huge sums of money into their areas, made their areas better places than they were, given people better public services since 2019. And why would you not be enthused if you've done that? Because you would want to go out and sell your message and say, this is what I've done. And that's what Conservative MPs have done throughout the country.
Yeah. What about this then? Another part of this campaign today is around national service, which we expect Rishi Sunak to double down on in the not too distant future at some point this afternoon after the announcement over the weekend. Anne-Marie Trevelyan was speaking to Times Radio this morning, and she was asked whether parents would face prosecution if their 18-year-olds refused to sign up to national service. And I'm going to say, James, she didn't rule it out. She didn't rule out prosecutions for the parents of 18-year-olds who didn't want to do national service. What do you make of that?
Well, Anne-Marie's a very, very good minister, but she certainly doesn't have responsibility for this area. I think the Home Secretary, from what I read, I think it was in the Telegraph yesterday, was saying something very different in respect to that. But we'll see. The Prime Minister will confirm that, and I think the policy is an excellent policy. I've just come in to speak to you, Cal, knocking on doors in Bury, and the people that I've been speaking to say, thank goodness that somebody's got a bold plan that's going to take steps to give life chances and life opportunities to upskill young people throughout the country, no matter what their background is. They're going to be given a chance at 18 years of age to give something back to their communities. And what on earth is there to disagree with in respect to that?
So you'd get your kids on the National Service in the National Service queue?
1,000,000%. Why would any parent not want their kids to contribute something positive to their community? Why would they not want to volunteer in a sector which is benefiting the wider community? Surely that's what community, that's what, this country and the towns and villages that make it up is all about. We want to work collectively for the collective good, because if not, we're just individuals who sit in a house and wait for the government to do every single thing for us. And I don't believe that. We're individuals, we're part of an area, we're part of a community, and the way that works best is if no matter your age, you've got a stake in that.
And so then, what if all parents are not as enthusiastic as you, James? Should they be prosecuted?
I think we'll have to see what the exact, there will be rules that will come out from the Prime Minister. I can't speak in respect of those.
But hang on, what do you think? You're knocking on doors, you're saying the people in Bury North are generally enthusiastic for the policy, fine. But what if you come across a parent who's not that enthusiastic? Are you going to say, sorry then, you're going to end up in jail?
Well, these are 18-year-olds. They're able to make their own decisions in respect to that. There will be all sorts of reasons.
But the question's about their parents. That's the thing.
Will you tell me why would you? Tell me what is the argument? Why would you think that a parent of an 18-year-old would go to jail because of the actions of an 18-year-old?
Okay,
who is an adult.
So would the 18-year-old go to jail?
The 18-year-old would not go to jail. I can't see. I would have to look. I would have to comment in respect to the policy as in the details that are going to be announced.
I suppose what's striking, James, is that here you are, and we're very grateful for your time. We genuinely are, because I get that campaigns are busy and you've got doors to knock and all of that. I genuinely appreciate it. But what is jumping out to me here is that you are now being asked questions by me about a policy that was announced over the weekend, is going to be confirmed and doubled down upon today, but actually you don't know what's going on with this policy.
But I think what's interesting, Callum, is you're not really interested in the policy, are you? You're not, because you're not interested in community. You're not interested in people giving something back to their areas. And, actually the world being a better place, what you want to ask questions about is the people who won't do it. Why would people not want to do that? Why would people not want to go out and help their areas, to help people and to work in that way? You seem to be saying that the youth of today will refuse point blank to do this. Well, I don't accept that in the slightest. I think that people will take this opportunity, and it will be a mandatory obligation, perhaps one weekend every month. Why would you not do that?
Well, I suppose if it's mandatory, you're not going to have a choice. But that's kind of the point, isn't it? That what I'm getting at here is that you're having to now speak to a policy that you don't know the full details of. That seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, James, you're a deputy chairman of the party. It seems that this has been rushed out over the weekend, that MPs, and indeed deputy chairman, might not be fully briefed on what on earth is going on here. And we're grateful for you coming on the radio, but it sounds like you've not had the full thing.
We are completely and fully briefed. And what's very sad,
but you don't know if people are going to be prosecuted.
This issue, when this issue is about making communities a better place and having some belief in our young people that they're going to do the right thing for themselves, for their families and their areas, and you choose to take this line of questioning in respect of it.
Right. Why does it need to be mandatory if you believe in young people so much?
Because in many I've been a governor of a state nursery school in a very disadvantaged part of my area for the last 12 years. People need assistance to be able to get these programs, to be able to get these opportunities. The state needs to be able to say, and to be like it's happening in other countries, needs to say, we're going to be able to give you this fantastic opportunity to give something back. These kids, some of them will not have the opportunity to know how to arrange a placement with some of these agencies if the state is not there to help. And for the state to help, and for the programme to work properly, and for society to get the benefit of this, it has to be mandatory.
Understood. James, thank you very much. Thanks for your time this afternoon. We genuinely do appreciate it. You can head back out and get campaigning again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers now. That's James Daly, the Conservative MP for Bury North and Deputy Chairman for the Conservative Party.
Nigel Farage, who's honorary president of Reform UK, called it a joke. But some might say the idea from the Conservatives might appeal to Reform's natural supporters. Let's speak to Frederick Chedham, Reform's defence spokesperson, who also was a colonel in the British Army. Fred, this is Norway do this, Switzerland, Sweden, Denmark, France. Maybe the Conservatives are onto something.
Thank you for having me, Rosie. At first glance, it's a superficially attractive idea, which could appeal to some, but it's unworkable. You mentioned, let me go through the reasons. You mentioned Norway, Denmark, Sweden. All of these countries are countries with histories of militia, citizenship armies. They're not deployable in the way the British Army is. The British Army is designed to be able to be globally projected with the Navy and the Royal Air Force. So unlike countries which are designed for territorial defence and therefore the training burden is small, our training burden is extremely high. That's one reason.
But this is about giving young people a sort of sense of national identity and pride, isn't it? And, if we look at recruitment levels currently right now for the army, where you have much experience, this might be something that would galvanise young people to say, actually, this is something I really want to support.
Well, in which case, then let's put the money, 2.5 billion, into proper recruiting, retention and keeping the professionals that we have, rather than losing them at the rate of goodness knows what. I mean, morale in the armed forces is low. The Armed Forces Continuous Attitude Survey has just announced that 6 out of 10 service personnel report their morale as low. That's tragic. It was never like that when I was serving. And it's all because the Conservatives and previous governments have hollowed out our defences. Now, in terms of the young people, I hear a lot of Conservative politicians telling me how good it is for young people and what it's going to do for them. What no one's telling me is what it's actually going to do for the military, because it brings no military value to our capability. On the contrary, all it will do is give us some 30,000 people, which we have to train. We have to find a training estate for, which we have to try an infrastructure for which we don't have instructors, and presumably they've got to be paid, fed, clothed, housed, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, I'm afraid this is a bit of a policy that's been thrown at a wall to see if it will stick. And it's changing by the hour, of course, as we expect.
And, well, it's the Conservatives potentially trying to chip away at who they think might be voting for your party. Tell us, what would be deemed a success for Reform when it comes to the election in, just over 5 weeks' time? What's the sort of goal for the election? Do you have any kind of target for how many seats you want to secure?
Well, I think that would be slightly premature at this stage, to be honest. This is a new party.
But you must be ambitious. I mean, what are you aiming for? What would be success?
Rosie, I didn't say anything about lacking ambition. What I'm saying is that there is no track record, there is no data, there's nothing really to go on. I mean, we have a number of ideas as to which target seats we believe that we have a great feeling. But you will see, I think, that every time that we stand anywhere, we get a great deal of interest. And this is because our policies are conservative. They are traditionally conservative in a way that the current Conservative Party has lost its way. Now, how much that translates into, we don't know. But I'll say one thing, is this is a party which is not defined by this general election. It isn't a one-stop party. It's here for a long haul. And parties take time to grow. They have to build organizations. They have to find their roots. They have to establish their power bases. You cannot do that on the time frame of a general election that's been called in a snap way by the Tories.
Yeah, I wonder if that's a sort of quite heavy management of expectations from you to us about how you think you might perform, and a hint really that maybe you're not quite ready. I mean, you've pledged to stand a full slate of candidates. You've got until the end of next week to do that. How many candidates do you still need to find?
As I understand it, the party candidate list is complete. There may be onesies and twosies here and people's plans change at the last moment. But in terms of the number of candidates, we will be contesting all of the seats available, as Richard has said before.
OK, so bar one or two seats, you've got a full complement now.
Yes.
OK. How confident are you in all of those candidates? Because, as many as 110 seats, this was the campaigning organisation Hope Not Hate found, as many as 110 of those seats had to be dropped or swapped since January because you hadn't done the vetting right.
I think that's a little unfair. I mean, every party has candidates who fail the test, and so obviously some of them try to hide it, some of them put it to one side, some hope it won't come up, some of it is stuff that they do. I mean, I'm going to put our record of what we've got. If you look at what some of the accusations that that organisation, Hope Not Hate, levelled, it was because they didn't like the people. It wasn't necessarily just because of what they had done. And if we want to compare track records on sleaze, general suitability, failure, well, let's just look at both the Labour and the Conservative Party, because they've got, how many MPs is it that have been suspended from Parliament between those two organisations? Some of whom we don't even know why they've been suspended. So I don't think we're going to take lectures from Hope Not Hate.
But I mean, lectures from Richard Tice to the candidates was things like, for heaven's sake, if you're going to have a glass on Friday night, then don't use social media.
Well, I didn't receive that particular advice myself, so I can't comment on that. But I mean, like anything, we expect our candidates, they have a great deal of freedom. They are normal people that are in society. They reflect society, so that they won't all be the same Tory identikit drones which fill our green benches every week. They will be people who look at real life from a real life perspective.
I mean, surely you're not defending the actions of the people who've then since decided shouldn't stand as a candidate.
No, of course not. Who would? But of course, it depends on the reasons what they were. I mean, some of the candidate abuse that was levelled at them for trivial, past, or incorrect and misinformed events was considerable. So I think, yes, of course, there are always lessons to be learnt by vetting, but those lessons are learnt by the other parties just as much as they're learnt by us.
Fred, thank you very much for speaking to us. Frederick Chedham, Reform's defence spokesperson, who was also a colonel in the British Army, who also clearly agrees with Nigel Farage, Honorary President of Reform UK, that the Conservatives' plan for national service is a joke.
Well, we've just been hearing from Sir Keir Starmer and about some of the things which are being said about him by the Conservatives. But of course, this election is not just about the Conservatives and Labour. There are lots of other parties who are standing, and their vote shares will make a difference to who enters the next government. Let's talk a little bit about them with Kieran Pedley, who is from the pollsters Ipsos. Kieran, good morning.
Good morning, Adam.
Before we get on to the little parties, just want to ask you about national service. Do we have any idea whether this is something which hits the spot with the voters?
So I think on national service, it's one of those questions that it does depend a little bit on how you frame it. We've actually got an article out from earlier this year using the Sir Humphrey questions from Yes Minister to sort of show that. But I think on a more serious note, you will get more people, you typically get more people support than oppose the idea. And I think it is popular amongst some of the target voters Rishi Sunak might have in mind in this campaign, such as some of those 2019 Conservative voters that have defected to Reform. The big question, though, I think, with any polling question, isn't just whether there's support for it, but actually if it's going to move the dial. So with those sort of Conservative to Reform switchers, we know the big issue for them is immigration. So unless the Conservatives have a convincing offer on that during this campaign, maybe national service won't quite cover it.
But would you see national service as being something targeted at the voters which perhaps the Conservatives are worried about losing both to Labour and also perhaps more particularly to Reform?
I think so. And again, this isn't the top issue for those voters either, but I think it definitely is something that appeals to sort of older, small C Conservative voters. It's not something that, dare I say, young people are crying out for. So I think that's if you think of there being two core switching groups the Conservatives will be worried about, one would be those switching directly to Labour, because in many cases they count twice, don't they? It's one off your column and one on the Labour column. There's also, like I say, these switches to Reform that are very unhappy about immigration, culturally conservative, less likely to be graduates, really the core of the Brexit coalition that delivered Boris Johnson his majority in 2019. So I suspect that's where this policy is aimed at. With Nigel Farage not standing, maybe they think they can hoover up some of those votes quickly and narrow the polls a bit in the first week of the campaign. But let's see.
If you go to university, they didn't get support through Sure Start centres and youth clubs. Most of that has gone. They can't get on the housing ladder. They can't even afford to rent anymore, so unless they've got the bank of mum and dad. So our government has let them down over many, many years. And there's a real sense of hopelessness. And actually, we should be looking at what we can do to improve life for young people.
The announcement we heard from the Prime Minister yesterday is that it would be mandatory for all teenagers to take a full-time placement in the forces or spend a weekend a month volunteering. We have had clarification that it's not going to be enforced by criminal sanctions if you decide not to do it. But what those sanctions were, Luke asked Anne-Marie Trevelyan several times. She said those details will be worked out by a royal commission at a later date. So let's speak to two people with a different perspective on this. Seb Payne is the director of Onward, the centre-right think tank, who thinks young people will welcome the scheme. And Michael Angus works in the voluntary sector. He runs the Barron's Court Project. It's a charity who support people on low incomes, who's less keen on the idea. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Morning.
Seb, let's start with you. Let's say you're 17, the Prime Minister just made this announcement. You'd be excited.
I have to confess, as a 17-year-old, I was fantastically nerdy. And at that point, I was very into computing and that sort of thing. And one of the options that's being proposed under this scheme is cyber defense. And that's something that I think would be great to do. So I would be really interested in that. But I think ultimately, when you look at our research into people's views in getting integrated in the community and what have you, lots of younger people are really supportive of some sort of scheme that will give them better ties into British society. So even though the work we've done on Onward is slightly different from what the government is actually proposing, I do think that there is a well of voluntary goodwill that needs to be tapped into. We saw it during the COVID pandemic, and I think the majority of young people, according to our polling, would welcome such a scheme.
Yeah, voluntary goodwill, but this would be mandatory. And I guess for you, Michael, that is where the problem becomes. If people say, well, I don't fancy something in the military, I'll just do the volunteering on the weekend instead.
I think the first thing to say is you highlighted that the government said those placements that are in the military will be competitive. And, you know, as a charity, we don't just take anyone to come and volunteer with us. We have a recruitment and selection process. It's also competitive because we need to ensure that we get the right people. We're dealing with very often damaged people. I work in the homelessness sector, and we need to make sure that the volunteers, our staff, are people who are able to work with those guests in a way that actually helps them move forward and benefits them. So, you know, we're not just going to take anyone. And I think that the announcement was just so disappointing. There was so little information that it was scant in detail, obviously. And we need to look at the costs of this, because as a charity, we have costs in employing staff, in employing volunteers or recruiting volunteers. It's not free. People think you're getting something for nothing. You're not, because you have a lot of work to do. You've got DBS checks to undertake, a whole range of things that actually cost the charity in terms of taking on volunteers. So there's a lot more detail to come.
Yeah, Seb, I mean, Michael makes a good point to say, actually, is this just going to make our work really complicated, add on a whole load of admin to then have some reluctant teenagers on board who are not going to be helpful?
Well, I mean, first of all, that's why the government, or the Conservatives, I should say, are proposing a royal commission, because this is a big scheme and you are talking about millions of people getting involved in this. So it does require working through all the details on how much it costs and how it will be implemented and how it will work in practice. But the point about the reluctant thing is, I just don't buy that argument, as that it's not backed up by the research to say people don't necessarily want to do this scheme. You know, during the COVID pandemic, 3 in 4 younger people got involved in voluntary work. So there is that well that needs to be tapped into. And I think, much like many other rites of passage, if this becomes something that is just part of coming of age in this country, then I think people will accept it. And we've seen that in other countries, that, you know, in France, in Germany, in Switzerland, in America, they've all introduced similar sorts of schemes in recent years to combat these themes of alienation and unmooredness amongst younger people. So I think that, you know, there are things that need to be worked through on this, but what it's trying to do, I think, is a very good thing, and then we should welcome it.
Yeah, Michael, I mean, are you seeing a genuine sort of very healthy appetite from young people who are wanting to volunteer?
I mean, we get inundated with requests to volunteer in the charity that I run, and we have to be selective, as I've said, and work out who can do what and how that can enhance the offer we have for our guests. And that's our primary kind of criteria. But I also want to just talk about young people. You know, many of them have had a really raw deal. So this generation of young people, they're saddled with debt if they go to university. They didn't get support through Sure Start centres and youth clubs. Most of that has gone. They can't get on the housing ladder. They can't even afford to rent anymore, so unless they've got the bank of mum and dad. So our government has let them down over many, many years. And there's a real sense of hopelessness And actually, we should be looking at what we can do to improve life for young people. If we're talking about 2.5 billion, let's get it spent on reopening some of the youth centres. Let's get it spent on reopening and cutting the waiting list for CAMS, the Child and Adult Mental Health Services. And let's get it spent on support systems that actually help young people to belong, contribute and thrive, rather than a kind of mandatory system that just says you will do as we say, because I just don't think that's good for people. I'd like to just mention the late, great Nelson Mandela, who is one of my heroes. And he talks about volunteering. And he says, there can be no greater gift than that of giving of one's time and energy in helping others without expecting anything in return. This scheme actually demeans that, because you're being told you have to do it. It's mandatory, whether you like it or not.
Seb, that is part of the problem, isn't it? Is that you're saying, no choice, you've got to do it, and you'll be punished if you don't.
Well, I think, as I said, the work that we've done at Onward was focused, and we looked at all different schemes across the world, what has worked, what has not worked, and we focused on a opt-out scheme. So the default is everyone does it, but if you don't want to do it, you can opt out. And I think when you look at this kind of scheme that would go through a Royal Commission, that may be where it ultimately ends up, as opposed to compulsory, because I think you've got to make sure that you obviously do get buy-in from families and parents on this. But
yeah, Seb, do you think the messaging maybe has been a bit unwise, that the first thing people are thinking is, oh my gosh, am I going to sort of be criminalised if I say I don't want to do this?
Okay, well, I mean, I think this thing has started a pretty big debate. I'm not sure the first thing people were thinking about was necessarily being criminalised. I think people have been thinking about how the scheme would work in practice and whether people agree or don't agree with the details that have been put out. But I think the ultimate point is coming back to what was just being said about opportunities for young people. 1 in 5 younger people are economically inactive at the moment, and there's all sorts of reasons for that, but that number has been growing very rapidly, and I think something does need to be done to do that. And in terms of houses and jobs and general economic opportunities, yes, there are other things that need to be done, particularly with getting access to good affordable housing, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't also look at this fact about that they feel less connected to society and less involved in what you might call sort of British, whatever the British identity is, and that's what this thing is trying to tackle.
Yeah, I think that's the idea. Whether the execution of it is possible, I think, is what's being challenged. Michael, can I just ask? You say you're inundated with people who want to kind of help and volunteer. What do you think is behind that? Is it young people trying to get something on their CV? Or is it something about wanting to help people and say, look, I want, I've got, this is my sort of time, this is my disposable time that I could do something really positive with it? Or is it, getting a step up above your other colleagues?
I think it inherently comes from the fact people are good. I genuinely feel people are good. And most people want to make a difference in society. Most people want to make a difference in other people's lives if they can. Most people don't know how to help other people or those people in most need. So we have to guide them, and we have to tell them, and we have to nurture them and let them flourish in those situations. For me, it's just about that the scheme, when it was announced, just didn't cut through that. It just, was scant on detail, as I've said. But, we need to have volunteers who are going to add something, who are going to work with our guests in a way that protects the guests and also protects those volunteering, so that they're not traumatized and it's safe for everyone. So that's where I come from.
Thank you both very much for your time. Michael Angus speaking there, works in the voluntary sector, who runs the Barron's Court Project, and Seb Payne, the director of Onward, the centre-right think tank, who thinks all the young people will welcome it.
If the 18-year-old decide to don't want to do any of this national service business, if it goes on and on and on, the parents might be prosecuted.
Well, so Lucas, I said, I'm not going to write the detailed policy now. That's what a Royal Commission programme of works will be for. The Prime Minister's been clear. We would bring in a National Service Act. So that would be in the same way that Labour did when education or training to 18 was brought in. The change in the law means that there will be a clear framework set out, and we'll look forward to seeing that roll out should we be fortunate enough to win the election.
I'm not sure anyone had national service on their election bingo card for yesterday. We did have a key clarification on that new pledge from Rishi Sunak, though. Even though it will be compulsory, either a full-time placement in the forces or a weekend a month volunteering, there would be no criminal sanctions for 18-year-olds who failed to comply. How would that work? A serious plan that's useful for young people and the places they volunteer in? Or is it just a quick headline-grabbing gimmick, as Labour have called it? Live with us on Times Radio Breakfast, Foreign Office Minister Anne-Marie Trevelyan. Morning.
Good morning.
What would it have been for an 18-year-old Anne-Marie Trevelyan? Forces of volunteering.
So I think it's a really exciting policy. As you say, there will be choices. So there will be 30,000 places for those who wish to apply. It will be a competitive process to join the military for a year's commission. But of course, for the large majority of 18-year-olds, the opportunity to volunteer in their local community or more widely through one of the many organisations that are there. And of course, the Royal Commission, which the Prime Minister set out, would look at this formally, would work out the details, the flows, and as you mentioned, the question of sanctions, much like it's compulsory to stay at school or in educational training until you're 18. There isn't a criminal sanction for it, but it is a compulsory activity and everyone joins in as a result.
And what would you have done?
In my choice, there's a question. Do you know now, much further on, because as a minister and an MP, I spent a lot of time working with our military, with our armed forces families. I think I would apply to join the armed forces. I have no idea if I would pass whatever those tests and competitive skills would be, but I think that would be a really exciting way to spend a year to discover more about myself, because when you talk to anyone who joins the military, that's as much that as well as the camaraderie and the skills that you learn in that organisation.
But you'll know more than anyone, because you've previously, even as a minister, called for more funding for the armed forces.
Yes.
That might be great for you. You might be able to find yourself. You might have to enjoy lots of camaraderie. But would the armed forces want you? The armed forces minister, responding to a question in the Commons the other day, said that national service could damage morale, recruitment, retention, and would consume professional military and naval resources. They don't need this, do they?
So that question was in relation to if you like, the old-fashioned version of conscription, which is absolutely not what this policy is.
He said it related to, quote, any form of national service.
So this scheme, which is very clearly set out, would be for a year's commission for young people to learn military skills in one of the places. Also, of course, more widely in these whole new areas of cyber and other technical skills that are as important now as what one might call the traditional 3 services. This will be an opportunity for young people to apply for a year's training in that, which will stand them in incredibly good stead going forwards into whatever they choose.
Sorry, I understand what the opportunity will be for the young people, but I just wonder if the armed forces, you're after trained personnel, you're after more money, you're after equipment, and instead you've got a load of 18-year-olds who might have checked this box when given this choice, but separate to this scheme, they didn't choose to join the armed forces, otherwise they would have done anyway. What use would they be to the armed forces?
Well, so the armed forces bring everyone who starts is untrained. This will be an opportunity to train up and skill about 30,000 young people who would obviously be very excited about the prospect, because that will be their choice rather than the many other options in terms of volunteering in your community and more widely will be available and part of this programme. And it's funded, as the Prime Minister set out, through using £1 billion of the roughly £6 billion that we get back in from tax fraud evasion and £1.5 billion of extension of the UK Prosperity Fund, which otherwise would be running its course next year. So it's a fully funded programme, and it's really important to remember, as the Minister for the Indo-Pacific, someone who spends a lot of her time in the rest of the world, in a very unstable place where the threat to freedoms that we consider, the values that we consider completely normal, and indeed perhaps we take for granted, we need to remember why it is that we must be resilient, that our next generation have the opportunity to understand how incredible our country is and to be part of her future.
What would happen to me if I said, I don't want to take part in this? I'm 18, but I don't want to sign up and do military service. I don't want to do my volunteering one weekend a month. Maybe I've already got a job and that's consuming all my time. The Home Secretary said yesterday that there wouldn't be criminal sanctions. What would there be?
So, Luke, as I said, the Royal Commission will be charged with working out the details. But the reality is this will be...
What do you think there should be? Because you can't sort of float this and say, well, we're completely open to any kind of sanction.
The idea is, in the same way that educational training to the age of 18 is compulsory, this will then be the next part of your personal journey, education, and the chance to really be part of your community if you're not choosing an armed forces route. And that will be part of the norms. So when you're applying for a job later, or indeed you're perhaps going on to university or college, this will be something that will be noted. If you haven't done it, it will become a normal part of that journey through from education into
so if you're using the
university and
example
work.
of how, so if you're using the example of how school attendance is enforced, if you don't go to school often, your parents can actually be prosecuted. Is that what would extend to this? If the 18-year-old decide to don't want to do any of this national service business, if it goes on and on and on, the parents might be prosecuted.
Well, so Luke, as I said, I'm not going to write the detailed policy now. That's what a Royal Commission programme of works will be for. The Prime Minister's been clear. We would bring in a National Service Act. So that would be in the same way that Labour did when education or training to 18 was brought in. The change in the law means that there will be a clear framework set out, and we'll look forward to seeing that roll out should we be fortunate enough to win the election.
So there are all these details still to be worked out. We had the Armed Forces Minister in the Commons the other day saying that there were no plans for any form of national service that had been drawn up. Is it fair to say this has been thought upon the hoof?
No, I don't think that's fair at all. The question, which was put, a written question, was about conscription, and the answer was given because
any form of national service.
That's at that point there was that was not a question on the table. I think it's really important to remember that we are setting forward a plan for the future. The Prime Minister really wants to make sure that our young people are resilient, have the opportunities to be part of our incredible communities, and that they understand what's come before so that they can be the leaders of the future. We don't get our freedoms for free. We have to understand how we defend our values and how we look after the incredible communities that we live in. And we saw through COVID the challenges that so many young people felt as they were cut off from their friends and from their communities. We want to make sure that they can build on that, that they will have those opportunities personally and with their friends and wider groups, or indeed if they want to have a year's commission in the military to develop those skills and to be part of strengthening our incredible country.
From the nation's point of view, you get a cohort and a reserve of partially trained, and they would only be partially trained individuals who at least would know how to lace their boots up and fire a rifle.
We return to the big talking point of the day. Rishi Sunak wants to introduce a compulsory year of national service for all 18-year-olds who can choose to take a full-time course or volunteer for one weekend a month. Just a few days ago, Andrew Morrison, the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of Defence, said the government had no plans to reintroduce national service, in part because compulsory service could, and I'm quoting here, damage morale, recruitment and retention. But in a time of increased global uncertainty and shrinking military, by 4%, by the way, between 2023 and 2024 to be exact, is a programme that encourages youth to get involved in the armed services really such a bad idea? Well, joining me now is a former Army officer and defence commentator, Stuart Crawford. Stuart, good afternoon. Thanks for giving us your time.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me.
Stuart, just your thoughts on what you heard from the Prime Minister.
Well, I mean, I think it's fair to say that the devil will be in the detail, and until the Royal Commission, of which he spoke, looks at how this sort of scheme might be set up, we're slightly in the dark. What I think has been interesting is this sort of knee-jerk reaction from the usual suspects, and also from some people who should know better, because much of the media has presented this as being a return to national service, which for people of my age brings back a sort of collective memory of pimply youths in ill-fitting uniforms being bellowed at by red-faced sergeant majors in freezing Nissen huts in the middle of nowhere. And I think that is completely and utterly counterproductive, nor do I think that is the basic idea. I think there is, I can see the problems with it, but I think there is some merit in examining what is proposed further.
So I am curious as to why we had the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of Defence saying that actually compulsory service could damage morale and recruitment and retention. I mean, just practically speaking, Stuart, this idea that you'd get, and we believe that the number of places for the military would be limited to about 30,000. Now, around 700,000 people a year on average turn 18. So it's a different question of what everybody else does. But those 30,000 people that would come to the army for a year, how useful can they be?
Well, the answer is that in general terms, the old adage has it that one volunteer is better than 10 pressed men, or nowadays women as well. But 30,000 per annum is a sizable cohort. Mm-hmm. And at a time when recruiting and retention across all three services is having extreme difficulty, then it's something that needs to be considered. I think the important point here is that it wouldn't be compulsory military service. It would be compulsory public service. Yeah. And perhaps that would be a better name for the scheme, in which young people who perhaps had a tendency to the military might be able to choose to go into the military. And so therefore, they're not sort of reluctant recruits. They'd be sort of tentative recruits, if you know what I mean, dipping their toe in saying, I think I might want to be a soldier or a sailor or an airman, but I'm not really quite sure. And here's a year's opportunity to find out if that can be, if I'm right or wrong. From the nation's point of view, you get a cohort and a reserve of partially trained, and they would only be partially trained individuals who at least would know how to lace their boots up and fire a rifle, which would make the expansion of the armed services, should it ever come to national emergency, simpler.
Okay. Stuart, thank you so much for giving us your time. Fascinating to hear your thoughts on this. Stuart Crawford there, former Army officer and defence commentator. You've been looking at the fine print. The figure of just over £2 billion has been bandied about in order to fund the scheme. Where's the money going to come from?
Right, so obviously every party going into this manifesto will want to be able to say that their manifesto is fully funded. There'll be a lot of debate about what that actually means, but it does mean that for a scheme like this, parties will be expected to earmark funding. So 1 billion of this will be coming from cracking down on tax avoidance, which is something that all parties do going into an election. There's always a debate about actually how much you can raise through doing that. All governments want to minimise tax avoidance. The controversial bit is the remaining 1.5 billion, they say, will be using funding that comes from what they call the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. And it's quite important to sort of understand the chronology of this. So when the UK was a member of the European Union, it received funding from the EU under what were called structural funds. Obviously, the UK had paid into the EU first. These were funds that go to all member states, depending on sort of need and indices of regional deprivation, effectively to pay for things like youth training schemes, lots of infrastructure, bridges, concert halls. So if you drive around the UK, you'll come across places, typically in poorer areas, lots in sort of Wales, Scotland, north of England, that have been paid for by EU structural funds. Big promise to the Vote Leave campaign is that these would remain. That no area would lose out on funding as a result of Brexit. So Boris Johnson's government created a successor to these EU structural funds called the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, funded by the UK taxpayer, UK Treasury directly, rather than going up to Brussels and then back down again. What this is saying is that actually this fund will be closed only after 6 years of operation. So it came into force in 2022. In 2028, that funding will be directed into paying for this national service scheme effectively. Now, James Cleverly, the Home Secretary, was on the TV shows today saying that that's entirely consistent because, this is effectively a form of levelling up in that it's providing training for young people and improving their life chances, which, you can make the argument. It's it's not going to be bad for people's life chances. People might learn stuff, but I think it's quite important to, keep the focus on the original idea of the EU structural funds, and the spirit of the original UK Shared Prosperity Fund was the word productivity, right? So the whole point of these programs was that you would increase the GDP per head, improve the wages, the living standards, the economic activity of areas where these funds were directed. I kind of think it's quite hard to make a case that national service volunteering 1 weekend a month for 18-year-olds actually is necessarily particularly productivity enhancing. You know, they might learn stuff, it might help them a little bit in their careers, but it's not the same as, you know, building a bridge or redeveloping a commercial centre in the way that the original funds were often did.
Do you have any inkling as to how different this is to, for example, what David Cameron had suggested? I believe it was called Cameron's National Citizen Service. It was set up by the Conservatives in 2010. It was the central plank of that big society vision. Is this very different?
It sounds relatively similar, right? And you know, it's unobjectionable. I don't think anybody really objects to programs that, you know, provide opportunities for young people, particularly from, you know, backgrounds that don't necessarily have access to, you know, lots of these sorts of schemes to, you know, get people volunteering or engaged in, you know, structured programs, including, you know, perhaps an element with the armed forces. It does sound quite similar actually to Cameron's National Citizen Service, which he was certainly very proud of. Has I believe, I'd have to check this, I believe that its funding was actually reduced relatively recently. What I find fascinating, the politics of this, is that all this stuff sort of gets branded national service to create a memory perhaps amongst you know, some voters of national service in the 1950s and the early Cold War, perhaps because that, you know, brings a sense that it's sort of bring discipline to, you know, wayward young people. It doesn't actually sound very much like national service in the 1950s at all, because that involved sort of, you know, young people being, you know, sleeping in barracks for a year and marching around parade grounds and being shouted at and learning how to, you know, do bayonet drills and prepare for war with Russia. And it was folded actually in the early 1960s because it was, you know, the military services realized that it actually wasn't what they needed to be prepared for modern conflict. They like professional armed services rather than, you know, 18-year-olds being dragooned against their will. But it's quite interesting that cultural memory of national service, it clearly has appeal for people, even when you're proposing a scheme, which is much more like a Duke of Edinburgh scheme or something like that.
Well, and also quite interesting, it's doing the rounds on social media at the moment, but in Parliament on the 23rd of May, so a few days ago, Mark Pritchard, Conservative MP, asked Andrew Morrison, who's the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of the State of Defence, whether or not the Ministry of Defence had looked at the potential impact of the reintroduction of national service on national security. And just to summarise Andrew Morrison's reply is it would be, well, I don't need to summarise, here is his words. They're saying that it could damage morale, recruitment and retention. It would consume professional military and naval resources. So sort of the government sort of saying only a few days ago that compulsory national service is actually detrimental to the armed forces.
Yes, so I think he goes on to say or intimate that you know, the nature of modern warfare, modern armed forces, means that you need an increasingly professional army, an increasingly sort of technically adept army, and not, you know, sort of 18-year-olds dragooned against their will. But it just goes to show actually that when you use the term national service, people mean very, very different things.
Means different things to different people.
It does, but it's you know, clearly, you know, all the evidence is that when you poll this, it's for at least some voters, the voters of the Conservative Party are trying to speak to, it's very powerful. One thing I do think is quite interesting though, is that democracies everywhere, particularly in light of COVID and in light of the invasion, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or reinvasion of Ukraine rather, are talking about sort of resilience, and do they need to be able to you know, basically call on society to, you know, respond in the way that people responded during COVID, to organise vaccinations and things. And the government's been doing quite a lot of work in that area. And actually on election day morning, there was a really interesting speech by Oliver Dowden talking about this and the preparations they're doing to basically create networks of volunteers and, you know, people, you know, with skills, right? You know, people medically trained or people who've worked in local government planning, that sort of thing, to, you know, be able to step up in the event that something goes wrong. That, you know, that's a really interesting piece of work. It's actually quite different to this. So it's just goes to show, I guess, the importance of like precision in this debate about what actually we're talking about, rather than, and it you know, it does, the reaction on Twitter goes to show how, you know, whether people are wildly in favour of this or wildly averse to it, it really does touch some sort of cultural cultural buttons, I think.
Yeah, and we're going to play it a little bit later on in the show. Rishi Sunak has put out a TikTok video now where it has to clarify what this all means. I think his first line is, just to be clear, I'm not sending everyone to the army.
It sends out a subliminal message that you don't really like young people. We're already way behind in the polls in terms of young people voting for us. And we've now launched a policy effectively saying they're feckless and lazy and need a bit of a boot camp. I think it's a terrible idea.
First up, and on the front page indeed of today's Sunday Times, the new Conservative plan to require every 18-year-old by law to sign up for a year of national service. It would involve young people being given the choice between a full-time course or spending 1 weekend a month volunteering in their community. There will be sanctions apparently for those who don't take part, but we don't quite know what those sanctions are yet. There's still a lot of detail to come out of this. Up to 30,000 full-time positions will be created in the armed forces or cybersecurity training. Right then, let's start with Lord Vasey. Is this a gimmick or a masterstroke, do you think?
The former. It's a policy that's trotted out regularly as a sort of shorthand for solving the problems of the nation's youth. It smacks of the 1980s. It smacks of looking backwards. We do have the National Citizen Service. I don't know how successful that has been. By all accounts, it is quite effective, and certainly people who've been on it do enjoy it and find it interesting. But an off-the-shelf policy about national service, completely out of the blue, with no context, strikes me, I'm afraid, as a gimmick. And I think the worst thing about it is it's the sort of policy that might appeal to some people over the age of 50, but it certainly won't appeal to many people under the age of 25, particularly when you use words like sanctions if you don't do it. And it sends out a subliminal message that you don't really like young people. We're already way behind in the polls in terms of young people voting for us. And we've now launched a policy effectively saying they're feckless and lazy and need a bit of a boot camp. I think it's a terrible idea.
Although under the big society, the National Citizenship Service you mentioned there, although Rishi Sunak as Chancellor actually took a bit of money away from that. Diane, what do you make of this? Do you think it's a really good idea? Will this get young people contributing to the nation, achieving a sense of purpose and so on? What do you make of it?
Oh God! And this over 70-year-old me, it's not popular with me either. Not just because I've got a 19-year-old granddaughter. No, I mean this is a disaster. It is extraordinary, isn't it? This government's been in for 14 years. It has, in that time, I think, halved the amount of money that local authorities were able to spend on services for young people, and now they think maybe young people need services. But I mean, there are fundamental problems about it. I think that, you can't just put people in the army. They couldn't, get involved in conflict anyway. So, what are you going to do? Who in the army is going to train them?
But it's not just about military service, though, Diane. Obviously, it's
No,
about NHS and volunteering with older people, for example. Maybe this is something that young people might enjoy doing.
Yeah, well, I mean, on the army side, I think there's a major problem. But on the other side, I used to run charities. Well, I have to say, I don't think I could suddenly recruit staff to be working over the weekends to be able to suddenly, use these young people. Not every charity can do that. And those who are looking after vulnerable children or vulnerable old people, the idea that you can suddenly put young people in there over a weekend, untrained, dealing with vulnerable people without enormous amount of supervision and training, it just shows that people don't even understand what charities do. I've run a couple of charities, but I was working with people with really serious drug and alcohol problems. You cannot put untrained people in to deal with people like that. What we do is end them off trying to raise money on the streets or something, do fundraising. Well, that's not going to teach people an awful lot. It's ill thought out.
Okay.
I mean, one of my colleagues said it was back of an envelope stuff. Well, it seems to me like back of a postage stamp.
Well, Rishi Sunak certainly thinks it's a good idea anyway. We can now hear from him. This is what the Prime Minister said about the national service idea.
This ambition benefits our country and our young people alike. Just look at Sweden, where 80% of young people completing national service say they'd recommend it to their friends. Uncertain times call for a clear plan and bold action to chart a course to a secure future. Our plan will ensure new generations and our country meet the challenges of the uncertain world. Keir Starmer and Labour don't have a clear plan and won't take the bold action to navigate to a more secure future.
Meeting the challenges of an uncertain world is something that Rishi Sunak keeps talking about. I was actually there at the policy exchange at the Westminster think tank. I used to work in politics. I was a special advisor for 3.5 years, worked for the Conservative government. And Rishi Sunak likes talking about this an awful lot, Ed Vaizey, doesn't he, in terms of the problems, the security threat, and him saying that Keir Starmer could actually be a threat to our nation. He seems to be sort of folding this all together. Is this part of a clear strategy, do you think?
Yes, there's definitely a clear strategy, and you know what the Tories are going to take to Labour in the next 6 weeks. One is the lack of a plan. So whatever you think of the Conservative government and its record, they will say they've got a plan to fix the problems that Britain faces. And definitely national security. You've seen Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, for example, say that he doesn't doubt Labour's commitment to defending Ukraine, but he wonders whether they're ready to make the tough decisions that Grant Shapps and other members of the government have been taking. You can believe that or not, but that is definitely the strategy. And that's why it is right that it's a correct analysis that part of the national service policy is, again, to kind of try and put security at the centre of the manifesto. That's why, for example, what the Tories could have done is talk about actually their great success in increasing the validity and availability of apprentices, but that doesn't get you talking about national security, unfortunately, and that's probably why one of the reasons why they've done it as well.
Diane, do you think that Keir Starmer will continue this or even give it a second look if he becomes Prime Minister, or will this just go off and die as an idea, do you think?
I hope the latter. I mean, it's quite interesting if you think of 18-year-olds. You know, there will be people who are 18 who've got babies themselves, or maybe looking after elderly parents, or have other responsibility. A range of abilities, which some people will need to go out to work to look after their own families. This is so ill thought out. But I'd like to respond really to the other issue about security. I mean, do you remember? Well, no, you don't remember. No one's old enough to remember that after the war, Churchill sort of threatened that if Attlee got elected, we'd have the Gestapo in because he couldn't be trusted, and that didn't. Well, that.
So
didn't
this
work
is
too
this is
well
a
for
frequent
Churchill.
political tactic, Diane.
Yeah, the idea, and actually, of course, it's this government that's cut the services, and we're well under strength. We haven't got enough boats, we haven't got enough army. We're very small at the moment. Actually, it's always been Labour governments. Well, but it's not going to help by putting untrained 18-year-olds into the army. This really is not the answer. We need professionals. I mean, the great move. I'm young enough. I'm brought up in the forces. I'm a forces brat, as they call it. And I was there at the, involved or living there as a child at the end of conscription. And we moved then to the professionals. We moved to a professional army, highly trained, highly expert. I mean, the people who serve in our forces now are not 18-year-old amateurs. They are extraordinarily trained because, with the type of warfare now, that's what we need. We don't just need, I'm afraid.
The irony is that the Tories have actually been very successful with the reserves, the Territorial Army. It's now run by Mark Lancaster, a former Tory MP, now in the House of Lords. And again, he announced boot camps, as it were. The headline was boot camps a few weeks ago. It was a misleading headline. What he was really offering was you could spend a week with the military as a young person to see if it was a life for you. And the Tories could again have talked about their success with beefing up the Territorial Army, now known as the Army Reserves, and talked about expanding that, and still got security front and centre of the election by talking about that, rather than a policy that is easily derided, like bringing back national service, which is, the minute you say bringing back national service, it's a cliche. It's a sort of sketch in a pub, isn't it?